September 1944. London is still scarred by years of war, but the sound inside Allied headquarters has changed. The steady tension of survival has been replaced by something sharper, more dangerous: confidence. Reports arrive faster than maps can be updated. German lines are collapsing. Cities are falling in days instead of months. The war, some now believe, is entering its final act. It is in this atmosphere that word reaches London of an airborne operation unlike anything attempted before. Tens of thousands of men, thousands of aircraft. A plan so ambitious, it seems, designed to outrun the war itself rather than finish it. When the name is spoken for the first time, Market Garden, it carries the clean optimism of a solution, not the weight of a gamble. Maps are unrolled. Fingers trace a single, narrow road running north through the Netherlands. It cuts across rivers, towns, and open countryside, threading through enemy territory like a lifeline stretched too far. Along this road, armored forces are expected to advance with speed and precision. Ahead of them, airborne troops will seize the bridges that make the advance possible. The entire operation depends on timing so exact that delay itself becomes an enemy. Intelligence assessments sit quietly at the edges of the discussion. Reports of German armor refitting nearby. Uncertainty about enemy strength. Concerns about communication and supply. They are acknowledged, then softened. Momentum is doing the talking now. After Normandy, after Paris, caution feels almost disloyal to progress. When Winston Churchill studies the plan, he does so with a long memory. He has seen bold ideas before. He knows how easily optimism can mistake motion for control. What troubles him is not simply the enemy, but the structure of the plan itself, the dependence on a single road, the absence of alternatives, the belief that everything will go right because it must. He listens, he pauses, and then, quietly, he speaks the words remembered by those in the room. You can't be serious. It is not a rebuke. It is a warning. But warnings require time to work, and time is the one thing this plan does not allow. Decisions have already moved upward, outward, beyond the reach of doubt. Aircraft are being assigned. Units alerted. Schedules locked. The room warms again. The moment passes. And somewhere between London and the Dutch border, the future has already begun moving, whether anyone is ready or not. The summer of 1944 breaks something open in the Allied mind. After years of attrition and delay, the breakout from Normandy does not merely succeed, it accelerates. German defenses, once assumed elastic and resilient, begin to unravel with startling speed. Entire formations retreat eastward, abandoning ground faster than planners had imagined possible. What had been calculated in months is now unfolding in weeks. Paris is liberated without the grinding battle so many feared. The symbolic heart of occupied Europe returns to Allied hands, almost intact. Crowds fill the streets. Bells ring. The images travel faster than the facts. They do not show fuel depots running dry or trucks stalled behind the front. They show flags, smiles, and the unmistakable look of a war that appears to be losing its will to resist. Behind the advance, supply lines stretch thin across the French countryside. Ports are damaged. Rail networks are shattered. Ammunition and fuel arrive late and in insufficient quantity. Yet these concerns struggle to compete with the dominant impression of momentum. Confidence grows louder than logistics. Success, once achieved, begins to feel self-sustaining. Among senior commanders, a subtle shift takes place. Caution, long treated as a professional virtue, now risks being mistaken for hesitation. Speed becomes its own argument. If the enemy is retreating, why allow him time to recover? If ground is falling easily, why not press harder? The belief takes hold that motion itself can compensate for friction, that audacity might shorten a war that has already cost too much. From this belief emerges a powerful idea. The war could be ended by Christmas, not as a hope whispered in private, but as a realistic outcome discussed in planning rooms. Germany, it is argued, is reeling. One decisive blow might collapse what remains. The calendar becomes a weapon, and time a prize to be seized. For the airborne forces, the moment feels overdue. These units were created for decisive risk, not cautious advance. They have trained, waited, and watched others move forward along roads and hedgerows. Now, at last, There is talk of an operation worthy of their design, one that might carry the war directly into the enemy's interior. What few fully recognize is that momentum has begun to exert pressure of its own. Psychological speed outruns physical reality. Assumptions harden into expectations, and in that narrowing space between belief and verification, decisions are about to be made that will demand perfection at precisely the moment when the margin for error is quietly disappearing. As the Allied advance surges eastward, one proposal begins to dominate the conversation. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery argues that the moment demands something decisive, an operation that does not merely continue the advance, but ends it. His vision is simple in concept and severe in execution. A single, powerful thrust through the north, bypassing heavily defended regions and striking directly toward Germany itself. The Netherlands becomes the stage for this ambition. Airborne troops, delivered deep behind enemy lines, will seize a chain of bridges stretching across rivers and canals. Each bridge is a lock. Each must be opened on time. The paratroopers will hold them just long enough for armored forces to arrive from the south, racing forward along a narrow corridor carved through hostile territory. On maps, the plan appears elegant. A straight line, minimal deviation, maximum speed. If everything holds, the Allied armies will cross the Rhine, bypass the Siegfried Line, and gain access to Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. It is a prospect that promises more than territory. It promises collapse. But the same simplicity that gives the plan its appeal also defines its danger. There are no wide fronts here, no alternate routes. The airborne divisions, among the most highly trained units in the Allied arsenal, will be dropped miles from relief, dependent on a timetable that allows no serious delay. If the ground advance stalls, they will be alone. Conventional caution is acknowledged, then deliberately set aside. The argument is not that the risks are unknown, but that they are acceptable. Speed, Montgomery insists, will protect the operation. Momentum will prevent the enemy from reacting coherently. What cannot be secured through redundancy will be achieved through tempo. As the proposal moves upward through the chain of command, resistance is limited and brief. The desire for a single, unifying effort carries weight. So does the exhaustion of years spent fighting methodically across hedgerows and fortified lines. This plan offers an escape from attrition, a chance to replace grinding certainty with bold resolution. Approval comes with surprising speed. Adjustments are minor. Questions are noted, then deferred. The machinery of execution begins to turn almost as soon as the concept is accepted. Aircraft are assigned. Units alerted. Dates discussed. What began as an idea is now a commitment. And as preparations accelerate, the operation acquires a momentum of its own, one that will soon demand a decision not just about strategy, but about responsibility itself. At the center of the Allied war effort stands Dwight D. Eisenhower, a commander whose greatest responsibility is not tactics, but balance. He leads not a single army, but a coalition, British, American, Canadian, and more, each with its own priorities, ambitions, and political weight. Every major decision must satisfy not only military logic, but alliance cohesion. Victory, for Eisenhower, is inseparable from unity. By September 1944, that unity is under strain. Success has multiplied proposals. Commanders bring forward competing visions for how to finish the war. Thrusts through the Saar, advances toward Berlin, pushes along multiple fronts. Each plan carries merit. Each demands resources that are already stretched thin. Eisenhower must choose not merely between strategies, but between men who believe their approach is the right one. Market Garden offers something rare in this environment: decisiveness, a single, concentrated thrust, a plan that promises clarity instead of compromise. It aligns British ambition with American resources, airborne daring with armored force. Most importantly, it offers a way to focus the coalition's energy in one direction, rather than diffusing it across a widening front. Eisenhower understands the appeal. He has watched momentum build since Normandy, felt the pressure to exploit it before it fades. Wars, he knows, are not ended by caution alone. Opportunity is fleeting. If the Rhine can be crossed quickly, the industrial heart of Germany might be exposed before defenses harden. The possibility is not certain, but it is real. He places trust in his subordinates, as he often does. Montgomery's confidence carries weight. So does the professionalism of the airborne commanders who believe their men can hold long enough. Eisenhower's style has always favored delegation over micromanagement. He listens, asks questions, absorbs doubts, but rarely overrides unless the case is unmistakable. Intelligence briefings complicate the picture. Reports suggest German armored units near Arnhem. Signals are incomplete. Interpretations vary. Some analysts warn of strength. Others argue the enemy is exhausted, reorganizing, incapable of rapid response. The information does not present a single, clear truth. In a moment demanding decision, uncertainty becomes inconvenient. Eisenhower weighs risk against consequence. Every day the war continues. Men die across Europe. Cities starve. Civilians freeze and flee. If Market Garden succeeds, the war could be shortened dramatically. If it fails, the cost will be heavy, but not necessarily decisive. The gamble is asymmetric, and Eisenhower knows it. Approval does not come with enthusiasm, but with resolve. Conditions are noted, reservations recorded, but the decision is firm. The machinery of execution moves forward with his signature behind it. In accepting the plan, Eisenhower also accepts something less visible: responsibility for an outcome that cannot be fully controlled. The burden of command is not choosing certainty, it is choosing without it. And now, with the operation approved, that burden begins its descent from maps and briefings toward the men who will carry it into history. Winston Churchill approaches Market Garden not as a tactician, but as a man shaped by memory. Few leaders in 1944 carry with them such a personal archive of failure and consequence. 3 decades earlier at Gallipoli, he had watched a bold idea collapse under the weight of optimism and inadequate planning. The lesson was not that audacity was wrong, but that audacity untested by reality exacts a brutal price. Churchill understands the seduction of bold plans. He has felt it himself. In moments when wars appear to turn, decisiveness feels moral. Delay begins to resemble cowardice. To act boldly seems not only strategic, but righteous. It is precisely this emotional logic that makes him uneasy now, because he recognizes it too well. When the Prime Minister studies the maps of Market Garden, his concern is not focused on German divisions or estimated resistance. It settles instead on the geometry of the plan. One road, one axis of advance, no depth, no margin. The line drawn north through the Netherlands looks less like a breakthrough than a dependency, a structure that cannot tolerate interruption. To Churchill, the single road is the plan's true vulnerability. Roads can be cut, bridges destroyed, traffic stalled, weather intervenes. War, he knows, rarely respects timetables. An operation that demands flawless sequence is not bold, it is brittle. The enemy does not need to defeat it everywhere only once. He voices his concerns carefully. The British Prime Minister holds influence, but not command. Operational authority now rests with the generals, and with Eisenhower above them. Churchill questions assumptions, raises intelligence concerns, presses gently on the absence of alternatives. His tone is measured. He does not want to appear obstructive at a moment of Allied confidence. What he encounters is not dismissal, but inertia. The plan is already in motion. Aircraft schedules are being finalized. Units alerted. To challenge it now would require not merely argument, but disruption. Experience speaks, but momentum answers louder. Churchill recognizes the familiar pattern. Once preparation reaches a certain velocity, doubt becomes an inconvenience. Warnings are acknowledged, recorded, and filed away as contingencies rather than catalysts for change. The machinery of war, once engaged, resists hesitation. The Prime Minister steps back. He has said what he can say. His warning is noted, not acted upon. History will later remember the phrase attributed to him, "You can't be serious," as prophecy. But at the moment it is spoken, it changes nothing. As the maps are rolled up and meetings adjourned, Churchill is left with a quiet certainty he cannot prove. The operation will proceed. And only time, indifferent and exacting, will decide whether memory has been vindicated or ignored once too often. As preparations accelerate, fragments of unease begin to surface from the occupied Netherlands. Dutch resistance networks, long accustomed to observing German movements quietly and precisely, report something unexpected near Arnhem. Armored units, refitting, regrouping, not in full retreat but in recovery. These are not rumors passed along in haste. They are observations made by men and women who have learned to survive by being accurate. Aerial reconnaissance adds weight to the reports. Photographs taken from high altitude reveal the unmistakable outlines of tracked vehicles concealed among woods and villages. Analysts identify elements of SS Panzer divisions, units battered but not destroyed, resting rather than retreating. The images are clear enough to provoke concern, but not definitive enough to command action. Inside intelligence offices, debate replaces urgency. Some analysts argue these formations are shadows of their former strength, short on fuel, low on experienced crews, incapable of coordinated resistance. Others caution that even depleted armored units, if encountered unexpectedly, could prove decisive against lightly armed airborne troops. The disagreement produces no conclusion strong enough to alter the plan. Optimism does the rest. Reports of German armor are reframed as residual resistance remnants left behind by a collapsing enemy. The prevailing belief holds that the Germans lack the cohesion to respond effectively to a rapid, deep strike. Speed, it is assumed, will prevent concentration. The faster the Allies move, the less time the enemy will have to react. This confidence shapes practical decisions. Airborne drop zones are selected not for proximity to objectives, but for perceived safety and ease of landing. At Arnhem, paratroopers will be dropped miles from the bridge they are meant to seize, extending timelines and increasing exposure. The assumption is that resistance will be light, delays minimal. Timetables grow rigid. Each phase depends precisely on the one before it. Airborne landings must succeed on schedule. Ground forces must advance without serious interruption. Weather must cooperate. Radios must function. None of these conditions are guaranteed, yet the plan allows little space for deviation. The intelligence is not dismissed outright. It is acknowledged, footnoted, and absorbed into the background noise of preparation. Known risks remain known but uncorrected. Adjusting the plan now would mean revisiting assumptions already accepted at the highest levels. It would mean slowing momentum at the very moment speed is seen as decisive, and so the operation advances, carrying its doubts quietly within it. The warnings are there, embedded like hairline fractures beneath a polished surface. They do not stop the launch. They do not delay the schedule. But when the first aircraft lift into the sky, those unresolved questions will descend with the men no longer theoretical, no longer debatable waiting to be answered on the ground, where optimism offers no protection at all. But beneath that relief, friction begins to assert itself. Radios essential to coordination across dispersed units fail at an alarming rate. Frequencies overlap, batteries weaken, antennas snap on landing, messages go unheard or arrive too late. Commanders accustomed to precise synchronization find themselves acting on fragments and guesswork. Distance becomes a quiet adversary. Drop zones lie miles from key objectives, chosen for safety rather than speed. Every mile must be crossed on foot, through unfamiliar terrain, past villages and hedgerows that conceal more than they reveal. The timetable, already tight, begins to slip almost imperceptibly. It is here that time replaces firepower as the primary threat. The airborne divisions have not been equipped to fight prolonged engagements. Their weapons are light, their ammunition finite, their strength lies in surprise, and surprise has a shelf life measured in hours. German commanders, shaken but not paralyzed, begin to respond. Contrary to Allied assumptions, local leadership adapts quickly. Units are gathered. Ad hoc battle groups are formed from training schools, security detachments, and available armor. Communications, though disrupted, function well enough to relay urgency. At Arnhem, Nijmegen, and Eindhoven, the German reaction gains coherence. Roadblocks appear. Patrols probe the paratroopers' flanks. What had seemed like scattered resistance begins to stiffen into something more organized. The enemy is not fleeing blindly. He is waking up. By afternoon, the scale of the operation is unmistakable to both sides. The Dutch countryside, so quiet only hours before, now carries the sound of movement and gunfire. Smoke rises where bridges are contested. Paratroopers hold ground they were never meant to occupy for long, waiting for armored columns still far to the south. The first day does not end in failure. Many objectives are reached. Several bridges are secured. But the margin, the precious buffer of time the plan depends upon, is thinning. Each delay compounds the next. Each unanswered radio call stretches uncertainty further. As night approaches, the airborne troops dig in, aware that relief has not yet arrived and that the enemy is gathering strength. The window of surprise, once wide and forgiving, is now visibly closing. And somewhere along that narrow road leading north, the success of everything that has landed from the sky now depends on how fast steel can move on the ground before time finishes what fire has not yet begun. The 17th of September 1944 begins not with gunfire, but with engines. From airfields across southern England, the sky fills with aircraft C, 47 transports, gliders in tow, their silhouettes stretching eastward in long, deliberate lines. It is the largest airborne operation ever attempted. From the ground, the sound resembles confidence itself, steady, mechanical, unstoppable. Inside the aircraft, paratroopers sit in silence, broken only by vibration and wind. Many are young. Most have trained for this moment, without knowing exactly where it would come. Briefings have been careful, optimistic, incomplete. They know their objectives and outline bridges, roads, river crossings, but little about what waits between landing zones and targets. War, once again, is about to compress uncertainty into minutes. At altitude, the doors open. Cold air floods the cabins. Green lights flicker on. And then, almost gently, the men step into history. Parachutes bloom across the Dutch sky, in colors that seem almost ceremonial against the fields below. For a moment, the operation appears to vindicate every assumption made in its planning. The initial landings meet surprisingly light resistance. German anti-aircraft fire is scattered, ineffective. Some paratroopers land without hearing a single shot. Gliders touch down hard but intact. Weapons are gathered. Units begin to assemble. Reports filter upward. Objectives are being approached. Casualties are lower than feared. The sense of relief is palpable. The ground offensive begins with the confidence of heavy steel. British armor, led by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks' RRX Corps, pushes north from the Belgian border, engines roaring, tracks biting into the road. The plan demands speed, and on the first miles it appears possible. Tanks and half-tracks advance in a tight column, their movement disciplined, relentless, built to turn airborne footholds into a corridor of conquest. But the road they travel is not a broad front. It is a single elevated strip, narrow and exposed, rising above marshy ground and low fields. From the map, it looks like a clean line. On the ground, it feels like a funnel. There is little room to maneuver, little space to disperse, and almost no alternative route when something goes wrong. And in war, something always goes wrong. German counterattacks begin almost immediately, small at first, then sharper, more deliberate. Units strike the flanks, cutting into the soft edges of the corridor. A bridge destroyed or a culvert blown is not a delay of hours. It is the severing of the entire advance. A single disabled vehicle can halt everything behind it, turning momentum into immobility. What had been imagined as a rapid race becomes a struggle of inches. Traffic jams form where no one planned for them. Tanks, nose to tail, trucks stacked behind artillery, ambulances trapped among fuel carriers. The column becomes a living thing that cannot turn around and cannot fan out. It can only wait, or push forward, or stop. Each time the corridor is cut, the war reasserts its oldest truth. Logistics decide what courage cannot. Fuel consumption rises as engines idle. Ammunition is expended not in breakthrough, but in clearing roadblocks. Communications clog with urgent reports and conflicting priorities. The timetable, once precise, begins to lose meaning. Engineers become as vital as tank crews. Under fire, they move forward to repair bridges, clear debris, and lay temporary spans across broken crossings. Their work is technical, exposed, and often unseen. But without it, the entire operation collapses into stranded metal. They labor in smoke and shell bursts, measuring and cutting while bullets snap across the roadway. The Germans understand the logic of the plan, and they attack the logic itself. They do not need to defeat XXX Corps in open battle. They only need to interrupt its movement. A burned-out truck, a crater, a bridge approached too late. Each interruption is multiplied by the corridor's fragility, turning minor damage into strategic paralysis. Meanwhile, the airborne units to the north wait with a patience that grows heavier by the hour. They were dropped to hold bridges, not to fight sustained battles. Every delay on the road forces them to spend ammunition meant for brief engagements. Every stalled mile stretches their isolation into a new day. They listen for engines that never arrive, watch the horizon, and measure time not in hours but in dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. The name the soldiers give the road begins to carry a grim accuracy: Hell's Highway. It is not only the danger of German fire, but the psychological torture of dependence, an entire operation tethered to a strip of asphalt that cannot endure pressure from both sides. By the time the column advances again, it does so with a different energy. The initial confidence has been replaced by a more cautious urgency. The men understand now that the plan is not a bold sweep. It is a chain, and chains fail at their weakest link. And somewhere ahead, far beyond the stalled traffic and broken bridges, British paratroopers at Arnhem are already learning what it means to be the last link holding a bridge, with the knowledge that relief is not simply late, but uncertain. At Arnhem, the plan reaches its furthest point and its most unforgiving test. Elements of the British 1st Airborne Division, advancing on foot through scattered resistance and growing confusion, reach the northern end of the Rhine Bridge. Against expectation, they arrive intact. The bridge stands unblown. For a brief moment, the operation appears to have achieved its most audacious objective. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion establishes positions around the bridge, occupying buildings that command the approaches. They are lightly equipped, as airborne troops always are: rifles, machine guns, PIATs, intended for close-range defense. What they lack in heavy weapons, they attempt to compensate for with discipline and positioning. The bridge, they believe, can be held until relief arrives. German armor appears sooner than anticipated. Tanks probe the perimeter, their guns dwarfing the weapons meant to stop them. PIAT teams fire at point-blank range, exploiting angles and blind spots. Some shots find their mark. Others fail. Each engagement costs time and ammunition that cannot be replaced. Casualties mount steadily. Wounded men are moved into basements and stairwells, tended by medics working with dwindling supplies. The sound of engines and tracked vehicles becomes constant, echoing through the streets. The defenders fight from windows and rubble, aware that their position is tactically sound but strategically isolated. To the south, relief forces remain stalled. XXX Corps inches forward along Hell's Highway, delayed by blown bridges, counterattacks, and congestion. Each mile gained costs hours. Each hour lost compounds the strain on those holding the bridge. Radio contact is sporadic at best. Messages sent do not always arrive. Those received bring no comfort. German coordination improves with each passing day. Units that initially reacted in confusion now operate with intent. Armor, infantry, and artillery are brought together methodically. The defenders at the bridge are no longer an anomaly to be contained, but a problem to be eliminated. Ammunition dwindles. PIAT rounds are rationed. Machine guns fall silent, not from damage, but from empty belts. Frost's men begin to understand the arithmetic of their situation. They can still fight. They can still hold. But they cannot do so indefinitely. The promise of rapid victory, the idea that speed would overwhelm resistance, has dissolved into something older and harsher. Arnhem is no longer a gateway. It is a pocket. The bridge is no longer a prize. It is a trap. By the fourth day, the battalion's position is untenable. Buildings are systematically destroyed. Fires spread. The wounded outnumber the able-bodied. Command decisions narrow from strategy to survival. The question is no longer how to hold the bridge, but how long? When the final resistance at the northern end collapses, it does so not in chaos, but in exhaustion. The men have done what they were asked to do. They have reached the bridge. They have held it. What they were not given was the time promised by the plan. In retrospect, the operation's fate seems encoded in its geography. The bridge was not simply distant, it was dependent on perfection. And perfection, under fire, is a fragile currency. The phrase that will later define the operation, "a bridge too far," is not an abstraction. At Arnhem, it acquires its meaning in shattered buildings, burned vehicles, and men who held long enough to prove that courage was never the missing element. The moment the plan breaks does not arrive with a single order or a dramatic reversal. It comes quietly, through accumulation when assumptions fail faster than they can be revised, and reality advances without waiting for permission. Weather is the first uncooperative force. Low clouds settle over the Netherlands, flattening the sky and grounding the aircraft meant to resupply the airborne divisions. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, items calculated down to the hour, remain on runways far from the men who need them. What was meant to sustain momentum instead exposes its dependence on conditions no commander can control. At the same time, radio silence spreads like fog. Communications between airborne units and higher command degrade further, then vanish altogether. Reports arrive late, incomplete, or not at all. Maps show progress that no longer exists. Commanders are forced to make decisions based on plans rather than facts, believing objectives are still held long after they have been lost. On the ground, German armor tightens its grip. Units that had once appeared fragmented now coordinate with increasing effectiveness. Tanks, artillery, and infantry converge deliberately, sealing pockets and isolating resistance. What remains of the airborne forces fights on with resolve, but the shape of the battle has changed. This is no longer an operation awaiting relief. It is an encirclement awaiting conclusion. Timetables so central to the logic of Market Garden collapse under pressure. Each phase was designed to support the next, but delay has broken the chain. A bridge taken late is not taken at all. A road reopened hours behind schedule might as well remain closed. The plan does not degrade gracefully. It fails abruptly because it was never designed to adapt. In headquarters, the tone shifts. Optimism drains from briefings. Language hardens. Words like delay and difficulty give way to isolation and attrition. Commanders begin to confront facts that can no longer be adjusted away. The airborne divisions north of the Rhine cannot be reinforced. They cannot be relieved on schedule, and they cannot be expected to hold indefinitely. This is the moment when responsibility sharpens. No further maneuver will salvage the original objective. No additional urgency will recover lost time. What remains is a choice between accepting losses now or compounding them later. The gamble, once attractive in its promise, reveals its full cost. Withdrawal enters the conversation not as a tactic, but as necessity. It is an admission that the decisive breakthrough will not come, that the Rhine will remain uncrossed, that courage and planning, though abundant, have not been sufficient to overcome the structure of the plan itself. For the men still fighting on the ground, this realization arrives without announcement. They feel it in the absence of aircraft overhead, in the silence of radios that once crackled with instructions, in the growing confidence of the enemy's movements around them. The war has not ended here. It has tightened. Orders are drafted, revised, and finally issued. Not for advance, but for survival. The priority is no longer speed, but extraction, saving what can still be saved from an operation that has outrun its margins. The outcome of the gamble is now sealed, even if the final accounting has not yet been written. Market Garden will not deliver the war-ending blow its architects imagined. It will instead demand payment in endurance, in loss, and in the quiet acceptance that some failures cannot be disguised as near successes. As the fighting continues and preparations for withdrawal begin, one truth becomes unavoidable. The plan did not fail because the men lacked courage, nor because the enemy proved invincible. It failed because it asked for perfection and war, indifferent and exacting, offered none. The question that remains is not whether the operation can be saved, but how many will be able to leave it behind when the order finally comes to pull back from the ground they were never meant to hold alone. The withdrawal begins at night, as so many retreats do, quietly, deliberately, and without ceremony. Along the banks of the Rhine, exhausted soldiers gather in darkness, waiting for orders that no longer speak of advance. The river, once imagined as a gateway into Germany, now becomes a barrier to be crossed in the opposite direction. Under cover of artillery fire, small groups begin moving toward makeshift crossing points. Engineers work silently, assembling boats and rafts in conditions that allow no margin for error. Every movement is deliberate. Every sound feels amplified. The enemy is close enough to punish haste, yet distant enough to make silence essential. Men who have fought for days with little rest now move with practiced restraint. They carry what they can: rifles, documents, wounded comrades when possible. Much is left behind. Heavy equipment is abandoned. Positions once held at great cost are vacated without ceremony. The ambition that drove the operation north has narrowed into a single imperative: survival. Not everyone can be taken. The wounded, too many, too fragile, are left behind with medical personnel who volunteer to stay. Decisions are made that no training prepares a soldier to make. Names are remembered. Faces linger. There are no speeches, no last words that can soften the reality. War strips choice down to arithmetic, and the numbers no longer favor mercy. The river crossings are tense but controlled. German fire probes the darkness, but the withdrawal remains largely disciplined. Boats push off, overloaded, unbalanced, carrying men who have been awake for days and who now cross water they were once meant to defend. Some crossings are interrupted, others succeed only narrowly. Each successful return feels less like victory than reprieve. As dawn approaches, silence settles over the northern bank. The gunfire fades. Positions that had consumed so much effort now lie empty, scarred by shelling and fire. Smoke drifts upward from buildings that will never again serve their intended purpose. The battlefield exhales, indifferent to who remains. For the survivors, the weight of failure travels with them. There is no triumph in escape. Only fatigue, loss, and the unspoken knowledge that what was attempted did not achieve what was promised. Courage has been expended fully. So has endurance. What remains is reflection, though there is little time for it. German forces reclaim the ground methodically. They do not rush. There is no need. Bridges are resecured, roads reopened, positions consolidated. The enemy understands that the moment has passed. What remains is cleanup, an operation concluded not with celebration, but with control. By daylight, Market Garden is over in everything but paperwork. The offensive that was meant to end the war has instead carved a salient of absence, a space defined by what did not happen. The Rhine remains uncrossed. The northern Netherlands remain contested. Winter approaches. The men who return south do so quietly. There are no parades, no announcements of success. The silence that replaces ambition is not defeat, but recognition. The understanding that even the most carefully planned operations can be undone by structure, timing, and the limits of human coordination. The offensive ends without victory, not because the enemy proved unbeatable, but because the plan demanded too much from too many variables at once. As the survivors are reorganized and the front stabilizes, one truth settles into Allied consciousness. The war will not be finished this year. And with that realization comes a colder, harder patience, one learned not from theory, but from the cost of reaching too far, and the long journey back from where ambition finally ran out. Montgomery, by contrast, defends the plan with a different emphasis. He highlights what was achieved: territory gained, bridges secured in the south, pressure applied. He frames the operation as narrowly short of success, suggesting that factors outside control, weather, delays, unexpected resistance, prevented the final link from being forged. In his telling, the concept remains sound. Execution, circumstance, and timing betrayed it. This divergence is not merely personal. It reflects different instincts about war. Eisenhower's priority is alliance cohesion. Montgomery's is the credibility of a decisive thrust strategy. Both understand that history is already beginning to judge, even as the war continues. In London, Churchill receives the news with a quiet heaviness. There is no satisfaction in having been right. A warning vindicated is still a failure endured. The Prime Minister absorbs confirmation of his fears not as a political point, but as proof of a pattern he has long recognized. Boldness can achieve wonders, but it can also conceal fragility until the moment it breaks. Behind closed doors, private reckonings begin. Staff officers revisit intelligence estimates. Commanders revisit decisions that once felt reasonable. Questions return with sharper edges. Why were drop zones so far from objectives? Why were warnings about armor not treated as decisive? Why was so much entrusted to one narrow road? These are not accusations yet. They are the first movements of a longer inquiry. But publicly, the Allied front remains composed. Statements emphasize determination and progress. The operation is described in careful terms, avoiding language that suggests defeat. Political unity masks the tension beneath it, because the war does not pause for introspection. Germany, battered but still dangerous, is not finished, and the Rhine, unchanged by ambition, still stands between the Allies and the heart of the Reich. As new plans are drawn and winter approaches, Market Garden becomes something more than a failed operation. It becomes a lesson delivered at high cost. Momentum cannot erase logistics, and faith cannot substitute for certainty. Yet even as that lesson settles into the Allied mind, it offers no immediate comfort. The war continues. The front stabilizes. New battles wait on the horizon. And for the men making decisions in headquarters, the question is no longer how to win quickly, but how to win it all, now that the illusion of an early ending has been stripped away. In the days after the withdrawal, the battlefield recedes into paper. The noise of Arnhem and the corridor fades into the measured language of reports, summaries, and situation maps. In headquarters across Northwest Europe and in London, the operation returns not as a living struggle, but as lines of text timings, bridge statuses, unit strengths, and the careful phrasing of failure. At first, the reports arrive unevenly. Radio logs are incomplete. Units are scattered. Some formations have lost officers who carried the details in their heads. The story of the operation must be reconstructed from fragments. An airborne battalion here, an armored column delayed there, a bridge taken and then lost. The fog of war lingers even after the fighting has moved on. Then the casualty figures begin to harden. Numbers replace impressions. Missing becomes killed, wounded, captured. The abstraction of acceptable risk is sharpened into lists of names and empty places in formations that had been considered elite. Staff officers and commanders who had spoken of tempo and opportunity now confront the cost in a form that cannot be reframed by optimism. For Eisenhower, the aftermath demands more than analysis. It demands leadership that protects the coalition from fracture. He understands that public unity is itself a weapon. If the Allies begin to fight one another politically, Germany gains time. And time, after Market Garden, has become the most valuable commodity. Eisenhower accepts responsibility publicly. He does so in the language expected of a supreme commander, measured, controlled, conscious of what is at stake. He does not blame subordinates. He does not allow the operation to become a public argument between nations. His role is to absorb impact without letting the structure crack. The true cost of Market Garden does not announce itself all at once. It accumulates slowly, through tallies revised upward, through absences noticed weeks later, through consequences that unfold long after the last shots are fired along the Rhine. What began as an attempt to shorten the war leaves behind a ledger that cannot be balanced by intention. More than 17,000 Allied casualties are eventually recorded, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. For airborne divisions, the losses are particularly severe. Units designed for shock and speed have been ground down in static defense, their advantage nullified by delay. Battalions that landed at near full strength return, shattered, their cohesion broken not by lack of courage, but by exposure to conditions they were never meant to endure for long. Numbers, however, only hint at the weight of what was lost. Each casualty represents training invested, experience accumulated, trust built under fire. Elite formations are not easily replaced. The absence is felt months later. When new operations are planned and seasoned, men are no longer available to lead them. Beyond the battlefield, the consequences spread outward into civilian life. In the Netherlands, hope had arrived from the sky in September. Parachutes descending over fields had signaled liberation to communities that had endured years of occupation. When the operation failed to reach its northern objectives, that hope curdled into vulnerability. The Germans respond with calculated reprisal. Food shipments are halted. Transport networks are restricted. As winter sets in, Dutch civilians face shortages that become catastrophic. The hunger winter of 1944-45 claims thousands of lives not through violence, but through cold and starvation. Market Garden's failure does not cause this suffering alone, but it contributes to it by leaving large portions of the country beyond Allied reach when relief was closest. For Germany, the operation buys something invaluable: time. Though battered and retreating, German forces use the pause to regroup, reorganize, and reinforce defensive lines along the Rhine. Units shattered in France are reconstituted. New formations are assembled from training schools and reserves. The Western Front, which had seemed on the verge of collapse, stiffens into a defensive barrier that will require months to break. The Rhine remains uncrossed. That single fact reshapes the remainder of the war in the West. Instead of a rapid thrust into the heart of Germany, the Allies prepare for deliberate crossings under heavy fire. Operations are postponed. Resources are reallocated. What was meant to be a decisive shortcut becomes a long detour through attrition. Momentum, once treated as a weapon in itself, gives way to a colder understanding. Speed has limits. Audacity must be supported by redundancy. Plans that cannot absorb friction invite disaster. These lessons are not new, but they are relearned here at considerable cost. Strategic patience returns, not as a preference, but as a necessity. The Allied advance slows into methodical progress. Supply lines are rebuilt. Ports are cleared. Railways repaired. Air superiority is used not to leap ahead, but to grind down resistance systematically. The war resumes its older rhythm, measured, costly, and unglamorous. Within Allied command, Market Garden becomes a reference point. Not a scandal, but a caution. Its name enters planning discussions as shorthand for overreach. The phrase, "a bridge too far," moves from metaphor into doctrine. A reminder that success achieved at the edge of feasibility is success borrowed against time. And time, once lost, cannot be reclaimed. The opportunity Market Garden sought to seize the chance to end the war in 1944 never returns. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, Germany is already collapsing from multiple directions. The crossing is successful, overwhelming, and decisive, but it comes months later than imagined. And after further battles, that claimed tens of thousands more lives. In hindsight, the temptation to view Market Garden as a near miss is strong. Bridges were taken, advances were made. The margin of failure appears narrow, but this interpretation mistakes proximity for probability. The plan required not excellence, but perfection, perfect timing, perfect weather, perfect coordination, perfect enemy response. War does not reward such demands. What Market Garden ultimately costs is not only lives and time, but illusion. It strips away the belief that momentum alone can end a war already 4 years old. It exposes the fragility of plans that depend on a single thread holding under strain. And it reminds commanders, painfully, that optimism is not a substitute for structure. Yet the story is not one of futility. The courage displayed from paratroopers holding bridges against armor, to engineers repairing roads under fire, to civilians enduring the consequences remains unquestioned. Market Garden fails, not BEC. With time and distance, Market Garden settles into history not merely as a failed operation, but as a case study in leadership under pressure. Its lessons do not lie in tactics alone, but in the psychology of command, how decisions are shaped, filtered, and finally released into motion when momentum and authority intersect. At its core, the operation reveals a quiet contest between optimism and experience. Optimism is not foolish. It is often necessary. Wars are not won by caution alone, but optimism, when unchallenged, begins to resemble assumption. In September 1944, success had trained commanders to expect further success. Resistance was interpreted as temporary. Delay was treated as correctable. The future was imagined as an extension of recent victories rather than a new problem demanding fresh skepticism. Experience, by contrast, speaks more softly. It rarely offers certainty. It remembers past failures without guaranteeing avoidance of new ones. Churchill's unease, the intelligence officer's caveats, the concerns about logistics and geography all existed within the system. None were absent, but they competed against a louder narrative. That speed would solve what complexity threatened to undo. Intelligence, in particular, occupies an uncomfortable place in the story. It was gathered, analyzed, and presented. Reports of German armor near Arnhem were not ignored in the literal sense. They were discussed. But belief requires more than acknowledgement. It requires consequence. Intelligence that does not alter decisions becomes background noise present, but powerless. This distinction matters. Modern accounts often reduce failure to a single overlooked report or a misinterpreted photograph. Market Garden resists such simplification. The problem was not blindness, but discounting. Information that contradicted the desired outcome was treated as uncertain, while information that supported momentum was treated as sufficient. The danger was not unseen. It was deprioritized. Speed, elevated to a strategic virtue, replaced scrutiny. The faster the plan moved, the harder it became to question its foundations. Preparation created commitment. Commitment created inertia. Once aircraft were scheduled and divisions alerted, doubt became disruptive rather than corrective. To stop and reassess would have meant more than revising a plan. It would have meant challenging the emotional trajectory of the war itself. Authority, too, played its role. Market Garden was approved through a structure designed to distribute responsibility across a coalition. This diffusion had political necessity, but strategic consequence. No single figure owned every assumption. No single voice carried enough power to halt the operation once consensus formed. Responsibility existed everywhere, and therefore, nowhere. Warnings without power are a recurring theme in military history. They appear in memoranda, meeting minutes, and recollections after the fact. They are real, sincere, and ultimately ineffective. Churchill warned, but could not command. Intelligence officers cautioned, but did not decide. Subordinate commanders expressed concern, but deferred to the plan. Motion continued because no mechanism existed to convert doubt into delay. In this sense, Market Garden does not fail because leaders were reckless or arrogant in caricature. It fails because the system rewarded confidence over friction, because agreement was mistaken for validation, because momentum, once achieved, was treated as evidence rather than circumstance. History, however, does not weigh intentions. It records outcomes. The men who jumped, advanced, repaired, held, and withdrew did everything asked of them. Their performance under fire withstands scrutiny. The plan they served does not. And history, unsentimental and precise, separates these truths without apology. In the years after the war, Market Garden is debated vigorously. Some argue it came close, that small changes might have yielded success. Others see it as fundamentally flawed. Both views reveal something important. Proximity to success can obscure structural weakness. A plan that nearly works can be more dangerous than one that fails obviously, because it tempts repetition without reform. What endures most clearly is not the map, but the pattern. Optimism unchecked by skepticism. Intelligence heard but not believed. Speed valued above adaptability. Authority diffused to the point of insulation. And warnings that arrive on time but without leverage. These patterns are not unique to 1944. They appear wherever complex systems operate under pressure, wherever success accelerates decision-making, wherever leaders mistake motion for control. Market Garden becomes enduring not because of its scale, but because of its familiarity. The operation's name itself evolves into judgment. Market Garden no longer describes a plan. It describes a lesson. A reminder that boldness must be structured, that intelligence must shape action. With the passage of years, Market Garden recedes from immediacy into memory. The urgency that once demanded decisions without certainty gives way to distance, and with distance comes reconsideration. What could not be paused in September 1944 is examined carefully afterward, when time is no longer an enemy but a lens. It is in this quieter space that Churchill's warning returns. The words themselves were simple, almost casual. You can't be serious. They were not delivered as prophecy, nor framed as opposition. They were the instinctive response of a man who had seen bold plans collapse before, who understood how easily confidence can mask fragility. At the time, the words carried no force. In hindsight, they acquire gravity. Churchill's warning is remembered not because it was dramatic, but because it was lonely. It existed within a system already committed to motion. It lacked the authority to halt preparation or reverse momentum. And so it joined a long historical tradition, cautions that prove accurate only after their usefulness has expired. For Eisenhower, history's gaze is more complex. As Supreme Commander, he carried the burden of choice in a coalition defined by competing priorities and personalities. His decision to approve Market Garden was not reckless, nor was it naive. It was made within the logic of the moment, under pressure to exploit success, preserve unity, and shorten a war that had already consumed millions of lives. Historians weigh his choice carefully. Some criticize the gamble. Others defend it as reasonable given the information available. What endures is not a verdict of competence or failure, but an understanding of constraint. Eisenhower did not command in a vacuum. He commanded within uncertainty, balancing risk against responsibility, knowing that delay also carried a cost measured in lives. Market Garden's name itself becomes its epitaph. What was once a neutral designation turns into judgment. It is repeated not for clarity, but for meaning. The operation's title ceases to describe a plan and begins to describe an outcome, a bridge too far. The phrase condenses complexity into metaphor, and metaphor into lesson. Ambition, the story reminds us, is not a flaw. Without it, Wars stagnate and opportunities vanish. But ambition untethered from structure becomes acceleration without steering. In Market Garden, ambition outran reality, not by malice or arrogance, but by miscalculation of how much reality could be bent before it broke. The courage displayed throughout the operation is unquestionable. Paratroopers advanced against armor with weapons never meant for such encounters. Engineers rebuilt bridges under fire. Infantry held ground they knew could not be reinforced. Courage was abundant. It always is. But courage cannot repair flawed assumptions, nor can it substitute for time denied. Here lies one of the operation's most enduring truths. Courage and miscalculation are not opposites. They can exist side by side. Market Garden does not fail because its participants lacked bravery. It fails because bravery was asked to compensate for a plan that could not absorb friction. The war, of course, does not end in September 1944. It grinds on through autumn and winter, through the Ardennes, across frozen rivers and shattered cities. When the Allies finally cross the Rhine months later, they do so with overwhelming force and methodical certainty. The crossing succeeds decisively not because ambition has grown, but because patience has returned. Germany collapses in the spring of 1945. Victory arrives as it always does, unevenly, imperfectly, carrying relief alongside grief. The war ends, but not in the season Market Garden promised. Not before more lives are lost, more cities damaged, more time consumed. In retrospect, the temptation to see Market Garden as a tragedy of near success remains strong. Bridges were seized, advances were made. The margin appears slim, but this framing mistakes outcome for proximity. Near success implies control narrowly missed. Market Garden was not narrowly controlled. It was narrowly supported. What the operation ultimately teaches is not that bold plans should be avoided, but that bold plans must be designed to fail gracefully. They must anticipate delay, resistance, error, and weather. They must treat intelligence not as advisory, but as directive. And they must empower doubt early enough to matter. History does not grant exemptions for good intentions. It does not reward belief. It records results. Churchill's words echo not because they were eloquent, but because they were unanswered. Eisenhower's burden endures not because the decision was wrong, but because leadership often requires choosing without certainty and living with what follows. Market Garden's legacy is not a single mistake, but a pattern made visible under pressure. In the end, the operation stands as a reminder that wars are not won by speed alone. They are won by alignment between